Have you ever pulled up to a fuel station during a massive global crisis, looked at the digital price display, and thought to yourself, how on earth had the costs of petrol and diesel not instantly shot through the roof? I mean, when the news is literally filled with international conflict and global supply chain panic, seeing those steady fuel prices feels like a massive relief, right? Well, what if I told you that you are actually paying for that fuel anyway? It's just completely hidden from view. Right now, a massive economic shockwave is hitting India's energy sector, and it's time to unpack the invisible math behind your wallet. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a high-stakes 1.23 lakh crore financial rescue mission that is happening quietly, right under our noses. Okay, let's dive right into this. So, back to that question, why haven't pump prices skyrocketed? The harsh reality is, while the numbers at the pump haven't changed, you are absolutely paying for this frozen fuel through a massive 1.23 lakh crore rupee safety net. We so often think of global energy markets as this distant thing, right? Something that only concerns big politicians or Wall Street stock traders. But this hidden oil crisis is the exact reason why airline tickets for flights you haven't even booked yet are suddenly getting drastically more expensive. It's actively reshaping your cost of living in ways that just don't show up on your local fuel receipt. To really understand how a frozen number at your local petrol pump connects to surging costs literally everywhere else, we first need to know who is actually pulling the levers in the background. Enter the main players in the Indian energy sector, the oil marketing companies, or OMCs. We're talking about state-owned giants like Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum, and Hindustan Petroleum. These are the guys that buy crude oil from international markets, refine it into usable fuel, and then distribute it to the pump down your street. You've seen their logos on practically every corner. But right now, because of escalating geopolitical conflicts in West Asia, causing international crude prices to wildly swing up and down, these exact companies are taking a massive financial beating. And trust me, the stock market definitely notices. When these energy giants are forced to absorb massive global price shocks, instead of passing those costs on to consumers, their profit margins just evaporate. This completely craters their stock performance, making long-term investors incredibly nervous about their financial stability going forward. Let's use a super simple, real-world analogy to understand the truly impossible situation these companies are in right now. Imagine you run a local neighborhood bakery. You buy your flour from a global supplier. Suddenly, a massive storm destroys the global wheat crop, and the wholesale price of flour literally triples overnight. Now, in a normal business, you'd instantly raise the price of your bread so you don't go broke, right? But imagine if the government stepped in and legally ordered you to keep selling your bread at the old cheap price just to prevent public panic. If you actually follow that order, you're going to quickly burn through every single rupee of your hard-earned savings. You are being forced to buy high and sell low, and that is a guaranteed, fast-track recipe for total bankruptcy. Well, that bakery nightmare scenario, that is exactly what is happening to our oil marketing companies right now. Economists have a specific formal term for this massive gap: under-recovery. Under-recovery. It sounds a bit technical, but it's really just the massive financial crater created when an oil company is forced to sell a vital staple completely below its actual cost. It represents a staggering paper loss for every single liter of fuel pumped into a vehicle. The true cost to buy the raw crude oil, ship it across the ocean, and refine it is significantly higher than the artificial, frozen price they are legally allowed to sell it for at the retail pump. So every single drop of fuel sold actually deepens their financial hole. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would the government enforce this? Why are pump prices deliberately suppressed despite these wildly swinging international crude costs? It essentially comes down to protecting the public. The government's goals are pretty straightforward: prevent mass public outcry, stop a catastrophic spike in hyperinflation, and treat fuel as a vital economic staple that people simply can't live without. If you look at other major oil-importing nations like the United States or countries in Europe, retail fuel prices just float naturally. When global crude spikes, their pump prices jump up on the exact same day. But India historically handles this very differently. In past decades, the government used complex financial tools like issuing oil bonds to manage these crises. Today, however, the strategy relies on freezing prices up front and simply leaving the oil companies to absorb the massive financial damage in the short term. And the sheer scale of this financial damage is honestly staggering. The under-recovery rate has widened to a shocking 30 rupees per liter on diesel and 6 rupees per liter on petrol. Stop and think about that for a second. 30 rupees. That is not some tiny margin of error. Every single time a trucker fills up a heavy-duty 50-liter tank or a daily commuter tops up their motorcycle anywhere in the country, the oil companies are taking a massive direct hit. They're essentially subsidizing your daily commute straight out of their own shrinking pockets, liter by liter, day after day. And when you multiply those individual, daily losses across a country of over 1 billion people, moving goods and people every single second of the day, you get a genuinely mind-boggling number, 1.23 lakh crore rupees. Just to put that immense, sprawling figure into perspective, that is more than the entire annual economic output of some smaller nations. It is an absolute financial sinkhole. To save these vital oil marketing companies from total financial collapse, the government had to step in and orchestrate a staggering emergency financial lifeline. They literally had to drop this massive cash injection just to keep the lights on and keep the nation's fuel flowing. So what did this financial lifeline actually look like? Well, it was essentially a massive emergency Band-Aid designed to stop the oil marketing companies' balance sheets from bleeding out completely. It was delivered through a strategic mix of direct capital injections, special tax offsets, and deferred dividend payments. If you're not familiar, a deferred dividend basically means the government, which actually owns a huge chunk of these companies, agreed to temporarily wait to collect its usual share of the profits. Now, while this emergency package absolutely kept the companies alive, it definitely rattled investor confidence. Shareholders suddenly saw typical, predictable business logic thrown completely out the window. And the oil companies? They knew this government bailout wouldn't cover everything forever. They desperately needed to find another way to claw back some fast cash. Because the truth is, the government bailout just wasn't enough to plug the whole leak. The oil companies needed a totally new strategy, a concept known as cross-subsidisation. To easily understand this, think of a really high-end luxury restaurant. Imagine they deliberately charge an astronomical 30 rupees for a basic glass of tap water just so they can afford to offer a highly discounted, super cheap lunch buffet to local university students. The ridiculously high margin profit they make from the water directly pays for the heavy losses they take on the food. This hidden, behind-the-scenes system of overcharging one completely unprotected group of customers to pay for the financial losses of a subsidized group, well, that's exactly what the oil companies decided to do next. The oil marketing companies realized something crucial. While they were heavily regulated and forced by the government to keep petrol and diesel artificially cheap for everyday people, there was one specific fuel category that was completely unprotected by political price ceilings. And that fuel is aviation turbine fuel, or ATF. This is the highly specialized, high-purity jet fuel used by commercial airplanes. Because the companies are losing absolute billions selling ground fuel to farmers, truckers, and daily commuters, they decided to use the aviation sector as a giant financial sponge. They are aggressively squeezing the airline industry to soak up the massive losses they are taking down at your local petrol pump. Faced with their massive cash crunch and rapidly shrinking options, the oil companies executed a swift and frankly brutal tactical maneuver. They announced a massive, immediate 10% hike in jet fuel prices across the entire country. 10%. In the world of high-volume global commodities, that is an absolutely massive overnight jump for any industry to suddenly absorb. It wasn't phased in slowly over a few months. It was dropped on the commercial aviation sector all at once to violently stop the bleeding. And you have to understand, this strategy is absolutely devastating for airlines. In the commercial aviation industry, fuel is not just some minor incidental expense that can be easily brushed off or ignored. It is the single largest operating cost they have, by a very wide margin. Jet fuel typically eats up anywhere from 40 to 45% of an airline's entire operating budget. When almost half of your entire cost of doing business suddenly spikes by 10% overnight, it completely upends your financial planning. Airlines already operate on notoriously thin profit margins to begin with, so a sudden shock exactly like this leaves them frantically scrambling for survival. So, when we zoom out and put all the puzzle pieces together, we see this incredible, undeniable domino effect. First, it starts with a geopolitical conflict in West Asia, unexpectedly driving up international crude prices. Second, to protect everyday voters from the shock, the government steps in and forcibly freezes domestic petrol prices. Third, that artificial freeze causes a massive financial crater for the companies, requiring a staggering 1.23 Lakh Crore government bailout. And finally, to survive the remaining losses that the bailout didn't cover, the oil companies desperately hike jet fuel prices by 10%. Literally, a war across the ocean directly connects through a hidden financial pipeline to a sudden spike in your local airfares. And that perfectly brings us to how this invisible macroeconomic chess game directly impacts you. Following this sudden hike, major domestic airlines warned they have absolutely no choice but to pass this enormous cost directly down to consumers. Airfares are going to surge, but
Here's the kicker. Even if you never step foot on a plane this year, you will still feel this. When air travel gets too expensive, urgent supply chains contract. High-value goods that are typically shipped via air freight, we're talking life-saving medicines, crucial microchips, and the latest electronics, suddenly cost significantly more to import and move around the country. On top of that, the broader tourism and hospitality industries take a direct hit as fewer people can actually afford to travel. You literally end up paying for a crisis in an industry you might not even use.
But beyond air travel, we really have to look at the massive hidden threat of that diesel under-recovery we talked about earlier. Right now, everyday citizens are being completely shielded by that massive 30 rupee per liter gap. It creates this very comforting, short-term illusion of cheap diesel today. But make no mistake, a 30 rupee artificial price gap is a ticking time bomb. It is completely unsustainable for the long term. Why? Because diesel isn't just for personal cars. Diesel is the literal lifeblood of the broader physical economy. Think about it. Diesel powers the agricultural tractors that harvest our national crops and the heavy freight trucks that constantly transport vegetables, grains, and consumer goods across state borders. If the global crude crisis prolongs, the government simply cannot keep handing out multi-trillion rupee lifelines indefinitely. Eventually, that financial pressure will build to a breaking point. And if retail diesel prices are allowed to rise even slightly to reflect their true global cost, it will trigger a massive, unstoppable wave of cascading inflation. The cost of transporting literally everything goes up. This would directly hit your middle-class household budget, driving up the prices of your everyday milk, tomatoes, and clothes at the local market, and indirectly squeezing your budget for things like daily commuting costs and even school fees. So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding where that 1.23 lakh crore rescue money actually came from in the first place. Because it didn't just magically appear out of thin air. It came directly from the national treasury, which is entirely funded by your tax rupees. Every single crore spent saving these oil companies from global shocks is a nice short-term win for stable pump prices, sure, but it comes at a massive, massive long-term cost. It pulls critical public funding directly away from building new state highways, upgrading overcrowded public hospitals, and funding the very educational subsidies that secure your family's future. Ultimately, this massive fuel rescue package proves one absolute, unbreakable rule of the modern world. There is simply no such thing as a free lunch in economics. While your local retail petrol and diesel prices might be safely locked down for now, the real cost of this global energy shock is just breaking out somewhere else. Whether it's through surging airfares, stretched supply chains, or hidden reallocations of your public tax money. In a highly globalized world, an energy crisis happening in a totally different hemisphere will always eventually find a sneaky way into your wallet. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to consider today. Now that you've seen the hidden mechanics and the frankly staggering financial trade-offs required just to keep your local petrol prices steady, what do you think is the right path forward? Should the government keep spending trillions in our tax money to artificially subsidize fuel behind the scenes? Or should they let prices float naturally so we all see and adapt to the true cost of energy up front? It's a complex puzzle with very real impacts on all of our daily lives. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the numbers behind the news.